In college, I took a figure drawing class, and the teacher was adamant that you couldn't draw the figure if you didn't know what was in it. So he drug us over to the anatomy lab and had the anatomy teacher show us 2 cadavers that were being dissected by their med students. When it came time to ask questions, of course, have you ever found something weird in a body came up. The story is as follows. They get a body, and for legal reasons they aren't told much about the person aside from medical history. They were told that the old man was a sort of rock star type and was a one-hit wonder from his youth, and to use extra discretion with him. In particular, not tell the students who might recognize him. The lab is full of 20-year-olds, and so nobody recognized who he was, unsure if the teacher even knew, but it didn't sound like she did, or what his deal was, so they wrote it off as non-useful information aside from his lifestyle. He had drug use and alcohol issues in his life, and they were told he partied a lot. Cool. The body has a raging boner, like 100% of the time. Teacher doesn't think much of it, aside from that he was particularly endowed, and everybody wrote it off as not important to their studies. So they go through the general dissection that they do. One kid wants extra credit, and the teacher said sure. Dissects his penis. See why it's hard still, and write a report. Apparently they don't normally do that for that particular class, so the penis itself goes untouched from the dissection, so it would have otherwise always been a mystery. Kid finds an actual rod that had been medically inserted under the table, not in medical records, so that he would always have a boner and could get it up while on drugs. They suspect it was done over 30 to 40 years prior to his death. They removed it and keep it in the lab, I believe to show their students as part of a section on under-the-table medical surgeries. Anyways, that was probably the best day in figure drawing class I've ever had. Working in the ER, young man comes in, one of 4 in a nasty auto accident. Speed plus inexperience equals car flipped, passengers ejected. One expired shortly after coming into the ER. I transported the body down to the morgue. First time I had felt a human being with all their bones broken. Felt like trying to lift sheets full of rolling bowling balls. Once in the morgue, I commented how unscathed he looked. He really did. Some dirt, the ET tube, not much else. ME offered I could view the autopsy if interested. I was interested. The first thing they noted were the x-rays of the fractures. Basically all the major bones, including multiple rib fractures. When they opened the body, the organs were described as near liquefied. It wasn't until weeks later I got the whole story from the EMT who had been on scene. Seems the passenger, who had been half in, half out of the window while the car had been flipping, he was just days shy of 17. The driver was just days past 16. His parents had bought him a brand new car. He'd had it less than 72 hours. Driver lived, though with severe brain damage. Front and rear passengers died. Rear driver's side passenger survived with not too much permanent physical damage. I have friends whose kids are getting their driver's license. I never pass up a chance to drop that story on them. I've seen a lot of effed up things in my healthcare career. This is one of the grand total of 3 that make me tear up. And it's one from early on. My dad did autopsies as a night job while he went to college during the day. He said the hardest ones were the children. He did an autopsy on a 6-month-old whose mother suffered from postpartum, and she told the cops that voices were telling her to put her son in the bathtub. She ran near boiling water and held him under. He said when he got to the hospital, chunks of skin were falling off and the organs were liquid on the table. The other one he talks about are the people who are subjects of murders, and they are buried. The decomposition process needs oxygen to break down cells, and when they are buried, it takes a lot longer for them to decompose. When cops find bodies, they unearth them, and it takes a matter of hours for the bodies to decompose drastically. The smell of one particular individual that was murdered and buried in a cornfield for 6 weeks could be smelled from 3 floors above the operating room, and was so bad that it was making patients and nurses sick. I am not a doctor, but I did an internship in a coroner's office for a summer. My job was to help with autopsies, clean up the office, dispose of old bags of organs. Bags with pieces from each organ are required to be kept for 5 years unless homicide, SIDS, or unknown cause of death. Data entry, and other odds and ends. 2 stories that really stick out. On my first day, I was to help with an autopsy of a homeless man who was living in a storage unit. Remind you, it's the summer. He was relieving himself in buckets that he also kept in the storage unit. He died in there and wasn't found for a month. Anyway, when we rolled him out into autopsy, you could smell him through the bag, it was so bad. I can't articulate how bad it was, but I was gagging and we hadn't even started. But then something weird happens. One of the techs puts a sheet down on the floor before we roll the cart onto it. I'm like, why? We're going to have a disgusting, stinky sheet now. That's when the bag is opened, and I don't see a body. I see hundreds of maggots crawling all over, and they start to fall off the cart. I was then informed I had to stomp on all the maggots as they fell so they didn't spread throughout the building. So here I am, playing the worst game of Dance Dance Revolution in history over half a liquefied skeleton, holding my nose so I don't puke. The other story is that in the basement, where we would keep all the organ bags and stuff like that, we also had notable objects from old crime scenes like murder weapons, etc. For some reason, there were a lot of jars of fetuses, but that's a different story. Anyways, there was a butt plug in a bag that had been the case number written on it. Now, I found this during the first week of my internship, and I kept wondering, how does someone die by a butt plug? Now, I had access to all case files, as I had to enter data and all that jazz. So eventually, I ended up looking up the case, and it turns out an older guy had it in as he was jacking off to a magazine called The Spanking Times. Obviously, he died as his butt plug was in our office, but the autopsy showed he had had a heart attack, presumable as he climaxed. I suppose there were worse ways to go. I'm a vet student, and we have a pathology class where we do autopsies on dead animals, most of them submitted by local farms to see if there's something that can be contagious or to see if the death was a result of the way of living, some owners wanting to know what happened to their pets, etc. At first it's kind of disturbing, but after a few autopsies you get used to it. So anyway, during class one of the technicians brings in a big box, and you can hear chirps from the inside. Our professor was still focused on the first autopsy of a dog, but I managed to slip a bit closer to the box. Little chicks. They were adorable, so I stuck around to observe them. The technician then moves them all into a plastic container and asks me to hold the lid. I figured it was to prevent the babies from jumping out, so I gladly helped. However, before I can even process what's going on, she tells me to pop open the lid just enough for her to slide a hose in, and I automatically do so. She then tells me not to flinch. I saw that the hose was connected to a big red cylinder, but didn't put 2 and 2 together until it was too late. Next thing I know, the loud psst sound comes, and there's cold, white mist coming from the container, the loud chirps getting fainter. The chicks were sent in by a farm as specimens because there was a disease or something that contaminated the whole farm. They needed to perform an autopsy on them. The technician had to find an efficient way to preserve the specimens. She froze them to death with a fire extinguisher. I then knew what it was like to be an accessory to murder. I firmly believe I will never, for as long as I live, forget the dread of hearing chirps getting fainter and fainter until they stopped altogether. If you really, really, really love animals, don't go to vet school.